Welcome to the complete camera comparison between the brand new OnePlus 7T, the iPhone 11, that's the non-Pro model, and the Samsung Galaxy S10. I'm also going to be using a scoring system that's hopefully a little easier to follow than before. On the top left, you'll see whatever category we're currently talking about, so in this case, video quality during the daytime, and for each category I'll be giving a score out of 10. It will be somewhat subjective, but it'll hopefully just give you an idea of where I stand with these phones. We'll see which one wins at the end. Now, if you pay attention to the colors, one thing will become quite clear. OnePlus's footage is far more vibrant. Now, you might like this, it's almost like the company has done the editing for you, but personally, I think it's a bit much. I think that compared to the other two phones, the reds especially are pushed quite hard. But OnePlus's video dynamic range is fantastic. Details in the bright areas of the sky, they're captured best by it. Something that's starting to become a bigger deal in smartphones is the ultra-wide camera, and even though none of these phones are their company's top offerings, they've all got one. You'll notice how the iPhone and Samsung's ultra-wide cameras really are ultra-wide, whereas the OnePlus a little less so. I don't think it's a huge deal, but it's noticeable, especially when you're trying to fit large buildings or landmarks all into one frame. Another important factor is zoom. Whilst the OnePlus and Samsung, they've both got optical zoom cameras, iPhone 11 doesn't. So in this footage zoomed in 3 times, iPhone 11 is looking the softest and Samsung the sharpest. That said, even without the zoom, on balance, I think the iPhone has the most consistent, reliable video footage, closely followed by the Galaxy S10. Also, just so you guys have a point of reference, I'm going to drop the current approximate prices of each device on screen. Stabilization is getting good on smartphones, and if you need an example of that, this is me walking as carelessly as I could, all recorded in 4K resolution. But stabilization becomes a lot more impressive when we scale the resolution down to 1080p. In fact, this exact scenario, stabilization at 1080p, is something that each of these 3 companies have specifically addressed with their smartphones this year. And you can probably tell all 3 are fantastic. At this point I was slightly leaning towards Samsung's on the far right, but I had to be sure. So that led me to this. Here I am jogging, and you can probably tell OnePlus is super stable too, but it does have a weird warping effect as it tries to correct for my movements. And finally, pretty much a full-on sprint. Samsung's is astonishing, really. OnePlus pretty good too, but it kinda looks like with Apple, when you get beyond a certain amount of motion, it prefers to just keep the shake as opposed to having that artificial look that can occur when trying to correct it. So yeah, Samsung is king here, with the OnePlus producing a bit of warping and the iPhone just not being as steady. Mind you, the software may improve over time. Moving on to daytime photos, probably the most important category. But here's the thing, every single modern flagship can already take great photos when basked in light, so I focused on the most challenging scenarios, like taking photos when the sun is directly behind the subject. There's a trend. The OnePlus 7T shots are dark and grungy, almost like you've taken a normal photo but then dragged the contrast slider right to the end, in a similar vein to how its video looks. And there's 2 ways of looking at this. In some cases, it makes it an easy camera to use. You don't have to mess around with editing software, and it can mean a nicer looking photo, even if not as accurate as the iPhone, but I do think a lot of its shots could benefit from being more evenly exposed. You lose a bit of information because there's so much dark sometimes that a lot of the shadowy areas just disappear into straight black. It is still capturing that information, like you could take a OnePlus photo and just brighten it up yourself and it'll look fine, but out of the box, bit dark. Samsung's photos are punchy, but not in an annoying way or a way that looks super unnatural. It uses its scene recognition to pick up things in the image, like sky, for example, and it just slightly adjusts the hues to make what a lot of people would say is a nicer looking photo. To look at the actual detail captured, we can take these shots and crop in 20 times. There's not a huge amount in it. iPhone 11 shots are sharpened compared to the other 2, and the OnePlus is just a little bit behind in terms of information captured. It is a cheaper phone though, we need to keep that in mind. Another thing is portrait mode, and you're probably used to hearing all about how great iPhones are at portrait mode, but I wasn't actually blown away here on the 11. When taking photos of people, it's good. The software recognizes a person's face and creates a warm, realistic image. But compared to its Pro counterparts, the 11 lacks the telephoto camera that's usually used for this, and as a result, you can't take portrait mode shots from a distance, and even when you go right up to a subject, it's often not as good. As soon as you use it with irregular objects that don't obey patterns in the same way human faces do, OnePlus and Samsung just do a better job. The iPhone isn't always bad, to reiterate, but it just has the capacity to fall apart quite badly. The other caveat with not having a telephoto camera is of course with the iPhone 11, zooming in is just not great. OnePlus and Samsung, they remain fairly crisp even at 5 times magnification. The iPhone does have an ultra-wide though, and it ticks two important pillars. A, its extra width compared to the OnePlus is especially apparent with photos, and B, whilst both other companies, they ramp up the contrast with their ultra-wide cameras, iPhone doesn't. The 7T is good in the sense that it has less distortion than the other two phones with ultra-wide. Plus, it's an exceptional macro camera. The OnePlus 7T can get very close to your subject, although for what it's worth, I did have to take this photo a lot of times because when you're this close, even tiny movements are enough to cause blurring. So, in this category, whilst OnePlus does have a lot of perks versus the iPhone, like its zoom, like its macro, Apple's actual photo quality is almost always slightly higher, and that roughly balances out in my opinion. This again leaves Samsung as slightly better here, with a combination of versatility and quality. All three phones have their own unique advantages when it comes to slow motion. So to start with, they've all got the basics covered. They can all shoot slow-mo at 240 frames per second, and OnePlus actually does a really good job at preserving its dynamic range. OnePlus can also shoot continuous 480 frame per second footage. That's twice as slow as the 240 that the other phones can do continuously, but quality does take a small hit. But then Samsung can record bursts of 960 frame per second footage. That is twice as slow as 480. Although it can't shoot like this continuously. The main win for iPhone comes from the fact that it can shoot slow-fies, slow motion footage on the front camera. Although, whilst I'm sure people will come up with creative ways to use this, I can't see it being as big a deal as rear slow-mo. The last 2 years in smartphones have seen a serious shift to nighttime photography, and so now we're going to start pretty dark and get darker and darker each photo. On paper, OnePlus should be smashing this. It has the largest camera sensor and a wider f1.6 aperture compared to last generation. That said, it is up against two of the very best here, because remember, the standard iPhone 11 has the same main camera and the same night mode software as the $1,000 iPhone 11 Pro. If we crop in 20 times, the detail is level between the iPhone and the Samsung, but as the light dips further and further, the iPhone's lead increases. You'll start to notice when we get to ultra low light that OnePlus's shots start to look pretty green as it's struggling to find light at all, and when I straight up pointed it at the pitch black sky, whilst it was able to pick up stars, which is impressive, the colour makes it look a bit like you're seeing the scene through night vision goggles. It's a little more stable than Samsung's attempt though. Now, one of the new features of the OnePlus 7T is its ability to use this night mode with its ultra-wide camera too. And to be clear, this won't be as good as the main camera, but considering that the iPhone's quality completely tanks on its ultra-wide, this is +1 to OnePlus. Samsung's ultra-wide is better than both, though, and whilst none of these phones encourage you to zoom in with night mode, that phone also just about edges it if you do. In terms of flash, the iPhone is actually left a little bit behind, and its light doesn't give quite as much fill to larger areas, but it's not bad. Overall then, for night photography, whilst the iPhone's night mode is impressive, its limitations in ultra-wide zoom and flash would make me put these Samsungs ahead. Also, if you didn't already know, I'm hosting a big iPhone 11 giveaway with everything Apple Pro. All rules are in the description. Video at night is the one area where smartphones struggle the most because there's little light, so it's harder for cameras to capture information, and unlike with a photo where you can stand still for 3 seconds to get more light in, with a video your phone's got to capture 30 frames per second. Relatively, though, the iPhone is usually a little better at controlling bright spots, which can end up being blown out on the other two. But it's close. I was super impressed with the 7T's low-light footage. It could do with being a bit less saturated, but it exposes shadows much better than the S10, and if we try zooming in 2 times, the iPhone falls into last place because it doesn't have a zoom camera, and it becomes pretty grainy. If we pause this video at any moment, you'll be able to see that OnePlus is capturing clear, sharp individual frames, whereas on the other two phones, they're struggling, the motion is quite blurry. As for the ultra-wide cameras, I just straight up wouldn't recommend using them at night. They need well-lit environments. Overall then, for night video, I'm giving this one to OnePlus. 2 more things, front cameras and microphone quality. And actually in low light, OnePlus takes the crispest selfies, followed by the S10, but in brighter conditions, Apple catches up big time. Its camera has the ability to go wider than the other two, and its dynamic range is far greater, not to mention the iPhone's front portrait mode rivals many phones' rear cameras. When it comes to video, the 7T misses out on the 4K that both the other devices can record. I think Samsung's video is the best in terms of resolution, stability, and just color balance. OnePlus looks good, it's not wide enough. On balance then, when it comes to front cameras, I'd say the 7T is close to the other two, but not quite as good. Now, just before we round things off here, let's take a listen to the audio quality on all three phones. This is if you were talking, standing pretty near each of the respective devices, this one being the OnePlus 7T. Moving over to the iPhone 11, this is what you could expect this phone's microphones to sound like. And finally, the audio from the Samsung Galaxy S10. I'm going to give my opinion straight after this. So yeah, if they sounded similar there, that's because they are. The main notable difference being that OnePlus's audio is slightly tinnier, a little bit harsher than the other two. And, well, that leads us onto the summarized results. And again, I've gone through a lot of footage from these phones, many times more than what I've actually shown, but even then, the results will be somewhat personal opinion. The main takeaways are this: the iPhone 11 and Galaxy S10 are incredibly reliable camera systems. They have excellent dynamic range across the board and generally capture an accurate representation of what's in front of you. That said, whilst the OnePlus 7T doesn't win many categories, it's never far off, and that in itself is impressive considering how much cheaper it is. You can safely buy the OnePlus and not feel like you're missing out in the camera department, and that's a plus in my books. By the way, if you did find the scoring system useful, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know in the comments, because I got some feedback last time that the scoring system was a little hard to follow, so I've changed it dramatically, because I just think there's some extra benefit to be had from getting numerical values from this, as opposed to just looking at a load of pictures and me telling you what I think. Regardless, thank you so much for watching. My name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I will catch you in the next one.